안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. I hope that you enjoyed the lunch. So this session is session 3-2 of the Global Korea Forum 2025. We'll talk about the future developments of the National Community Unification Formula. We have 4 panelists here. If I were to introduce myself, I am a visiting chair professor at Gyeongnam University, Jo Sung-yeol. So, one by one, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Wang Sun-taek. I'm sure you've seen him many times, but he has been a reporter at YTN for 19 years, focusing on North Korean issues, and he is currently an adjunct professor at Seogang University. And next, we have Professor Choi Young-jun. He's also the visiting scholar at the Institute for Far Eastern Studies at Gyeongnam University and former Vice Minister of Unification. We also have Professor Kim Sung-kyung. She was there at the North Korean Studies University, and now she is an associate professor at Seogang University. Our fourth panel is Dr. Seo Bo-hyuk. He is a senior research fellow at the Korea Institute for National Unification. He is on his way, but I think that he is stuck in traffic, so once he arrives, we will introduce him again. So as you can see, the future developments of the National Community Unification Formula is our theme for today, and 4 of our panelists will deliver their opinions. And they are all delivering the various different activities and looking at the analysis of changing international relations. I'm sure that it's important for me to moderate and for the panelists to discuss, but I think that we do also want to have some comments from the floor. I think that as a moderator, I have been tasked with keeping the time. We started at 1:30, and we will close at 2:50 or 10 minutes to 3. If you have any other questions, please understand that I do have to keep the time for concluding our session. So we will hand over the microphone to Professor Wang Sun-taek. I think that it's important for us to have free discussions, so I will give you the floor for 10 minutes, and then we'll also discuss later on. So please, Professor Wang.
Good afternoon. I am Wang Sun-taek, just introduced. It's a great honor for me to be here in this important occasion to share my thoughts and ideas. And regarding NCUF, National Community Unification Formula, that's the topic we'll be covering. I know it's a tough topic to talk about given the inter-Korean relations. Dealing with this topic and talking about it might be not be easy, especially given the timing. But then we can talk about some of the fundamental elements which we need to delve into so that when a critical juncture comes, there might be fruitful results leading to significant, meaningful changes. I was not in the position of a manager myself. I wasn't studying at university for many years. I was serving myself as a journalist, visiting Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Unification, and Cheongwade, the Blue House. I've been to these agencies, institutes, and I have come up with my insights, which I will be sharing with you today. NCUF, the future development of the concept. Let me talk about it. Basically speaking, during the 3-year Yoon Suk-yeol administration, the issue of revising NCUF became a source of political division and also societal issue. Maybe there actually have been some contemplations on what problems there were, which I'll be talking about today. Although the revision was not ultimately carried out, concerns remain that similar attempts may occur or reoccur in the future. And also this concept, NCUF, whether or not this is legitimate or appropriate, we need to have further discussion on it. So I'll be talking about that as well. And also my final message is that NCUF can hopefully be carried on. That's my thought. And also, we need to minimize negative effects such as provoking North Korea. The formula should be operated in such a low-key manner, which is a diplomatic term. For the past 3 years, there has been lots of controversies, and since its inauguration in 2022, the Yoon government argued that the common formula did not sufficiently reflect changes of the times nor adequately embody liberal democratic elements, and thus pushed for revision. However, in the consultation of experts, they said that lots of good points to be carried on. So abolishing the formula would bring about lots of negative aspects. So Yoon didn't abandon it, but in his Liberation Day address in 2024, he came up with August 15 doctrine, and then which I'll just call common formula, which is equal to NCUF. But then he said he would not abandon it, but he actually came up with a rather different approach. Format-wise, it would remain the same, but fact-wise, there has been some attempt to abolish it. But then at the end of last year, we have had the martial law incident, and it was regarded as a civil war. And then we have a new government, and the August 15 doctrine has been abandoned and abolished. So there have been lots of attempts to push for the existing one, the NCUF, so we need to make sure that such a thing is not occurring again. Regarding NCUF, I think there are still lots of advantages and many implications, which I'll talk about today. So it is based on bipartisan consensus. Having bipartisan consensus is not easy. Has been over 30 years, but there are lots of valid points. It was very carefully made in terms of bipartisan consensus, so we should not really shake up the fundamentals, because all these bullet points actually are based on bipartisan consensus. If you were to change the content a lot, then the framework for the fundamentals might be shaken off. I think it's a very rational framework. There are 3 stages in the formula. Both North and South Korea actually they have things to do and they have things to agree upon so that they move on to another stage. So the first stage might take 30 years, a second stage might take 50 years. We don't know for sure. So it's something we should not oppose or reject. I think it's a very practical approach. In the first page of reconciliation and cooperation, in the second stage of establishing a South-North Confederation, both sides' autonomy and systems are respected. So it's very realistic. And also, North Korea in June 15 Joint Declaration 2000, it actually in principle endorsed the idea, but there are some constraints and challenges at the same time. Basically speaking, Chairman Kim of North Korea declared inter-Korean relations should be defined as those of 2 hostile states, thus rejecting unification discourses altogether. So we are thinking about pushing for this idea bluntly. And also there's a growing rejection among millennial Gen Z generation. Younger generation in South Korea increasingly display skepticism and rejection toward unification, raising questions about the relevance of the formula. Not only that, though, there's a lack of specificity, which is for sure very true. The common formula outlines principles and directions, but lacks concrete measures or detailed contingency responses, which has generated overall dissatisfaction. It's because of lack of specificity. And also, it might lead to misunderstanding by the international community. Hardliners in the international community have often labeled South Korea's moderate approach as pro-North or left-leaning, arguing that Seoul prioritizes unification over denuclearization. That is why there is ill use of the NCUF. We actually have to think about what we should do against this backdrop. What about the policy recommendations so that we can carry on advantages of the concept, but then we can complement any of the negativity? We need to have a low-key approach. We should not go loud about it. We should keep quiet. The contents of the comic formula remain rational and appropriate, so its substance should be maintained, but outward policy promotion should be minimized or it should be left to be at zero. Domestically, the government should spread awareness through institutes such as National Unification Advisory Council and Unification Education Institute, while refraining from active external promotion. So the formula should be treated as common knowledge among Koreans, South Koreans, but deliberately actually kept away from frequent public references to avoid provoking North Korea or creating unintended side effects. That's why I keep saying low-key is important. Here, in having a low-key strategy, there must be cooperation with the media and public consensus, because this is a project where taxpayers' money is used without doing promotion to the public. It's like spending money and then people would ask, what have you done? That is why we need the cooperation with the media and public consensus. These are so essential. That is why background briefings, closed-door seminars, and other methods or discrete methods of policy communication should be actively utilized. This is it. Thank you for listening. Thank you. It was a succinct summary of your thoughts. Thank you so much. And just like you mentioned, up until today, NCUF revision or abolishment has been topping the agenda. During Lee Myung-bak administration, there have been the concept of the three idea for the formation of the community, but it didn't come out to be true. But there was also Unification Preparation Committee in Park Geun-hye administration. One was Unification Charter, another was Unification Formula, and another was the roadmap for unification. But Unification Charter or roadmap could not come to into being. And also, just like Professor Wang had said, in Yoon administration, so there was unification doctrine with free democracy. So instead of replacing the formula, there has been some other alternatives like doctrine to actually express the sense of the government, but we haven't had any valid, tangible point.
So following suit, as I mentioned, the former Vice Minister of Unification, Professor Choi. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Choi Young-jun. When I was working at the Unification, I was in charge of policy direction, and then I was also the former vice minister. And it was also my role to organize and host the GKF. So I wanted to really have a lot of honorable speakers there. But while now I am here as a speaker, I think that it's a new feeling to be here as a speaker and not an organizer. When I first got the subject or the theme, I thought that it was somewhat unbefitting because of with the unification, because North Korea is saying that we are two hostile countries and we are two different nations. And there were some critics saying that we shouldn't unify, that North and South Korea have strained conflicts and that it's going to be difficult to unify. But I had a thought. Because first of all, if we have the right unification formula, it needs to be based on unification. In terms of why we need to do it, there are more than enough reasons, and we truly believe that we do need to unify the two Koreas. As you may know, we have struggled to achieve democracy and, of course, economic prosperity. We thought that we were safe and we were just smooth sailing, but I believe that there's still a long ways to go and we have many challenges. So, of course, unification won't be the silver bullet for everything. However, the unification issue is probably going to be, or it was kind of like a strap to keeping us from developing further. But if we can resolve these issues, I think that we can really use it as a stepping stone for further prosperity and growth. So that's why we need to unify. And it's a long-term process, as you may know. But so we need to have the right direction and have the principles in how to get there. And the various different unification policies should not overlap on each other and have a clear direction and strategy. Lastly, I think that most of all, I think the public should also be on the same page. They need to support and have consensus on unification. But without a right unification formula, it's asking them to support something that does not have an end goal. We can't just merely ask them to blindly follow us. So our official unification formula is actually on the Unification Ministry's website as well. So it's a National Community Unification Formula, NCUF, and in 1988, with democratization and movement for unification to bring the two Koreas together. So that's why we started the exchanges in terms of the economy and the people's exchanges. And we also had the four-party regime. And it was also a bigger opposition party rather than the ruling party. So that's why it was very difficult to reach a bipartisan consensus. But looking back from the present time, it was a valuable moment in which all of the politicians and rulers could come to an agreement on the same page. That's why they started to expand onto the policies and directions. What I want to stress here is that what we did in the past was discuss amongst ourselves internally, but in the future we really need to discuss in the external factors as well. So North Korea has to be in alignment in terms of politics, culture, and economy. And it's actually also embedded in the agreement, in the inter-Korean basic agreement as well. It's not something that we just discussed internally in South Korea, but it's also written and stipulated on the agreement. So it morphed into the NCUF. However, the core structure and the principles are the same. Of course, over the course of time, there were different criticisms on it. First, this kind of NCUF was not in the midst of strained relations just as now. And second, it's actually starting from the non-political spheres and then moving over to the politics. So it's also aiming for peaceful relations, but I think that there's critics saying that there's too much of a shortfall for the concrete directions. So having the national community be forward in the NCUF wasn't able to reach a lot of consensus from the public or from the political spheres. So in 1989, it was an agreement. And I believe that amid the changes brought about at that time, if we have agreed on it, I think that we need to safeguard the framework. I think the Conservative Party and the Progressive parties now have to get together. But in the course of time, over the course of time, I think that a lot of the extremists took it into their own direction. That's why it has morphed from what it was before. So I think that we do need to amend and improve on the basic framework. In terms of the politics and from the citizen side, we need one essential factor. At the time, we did have a bipartisan agreement, but it was a top-down basis. So now what we need is more of a bottom-up perspective, listening to the grassroots communities as well as the people, and have a two-way communication process. But is this truly possible? We tried it. In 2018 to 2021, over 3 years, we had around 60 courses and about 6,000 people participated. So we actually had this National Community Unification Formula and the discussion over it. And we asked about what people imagined to be their ideal form of unification. And that was a consensus that we wanted to draw out. And it was related to denuclearization, peace, welfare, and human rights. And these were supposed to be the objectives of the unification of inter-Koreas. And on the basis of exchange, communication. So if you think about the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach, we need to find a contact point or the midway point. And if we can improve on it, I think we will be able to raise the level of interest from the public and be more proud of what we have achieved, to add strength to the formula, the NCUF. And this is actually something that we had done before for 3 years. Of course, I mean, I'm not just going to talk about the last administration, but it was halted for a couple of years. So it's not just about the party characteristics. I think that it's something that we should agree upon altogether, party-wide, and bring it back to the surface. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for your comments. I think that this was a development in the NCUF, what he had done in the past Moon Jae-in administration. And I think the Lee administration also is considering, if you look at the final report, this kind of social discourse is pretty much put in the spotlight. So I think that just as Professor Choi has mentioned, President Lee Jae-myung is also looking into these aspects, and I think that that's also a very important aspect. So I will continue on with Professor Kim Sung-kyung. Yes, well, thank you very much. As introduced, my name is Kim Sung-kyung. We are talking about the NCUF, and so I would like to briefly deliver my opinions to you. I think that both of the panelists also mentioned, but this NCUF has a lot of meaning and significance. I think that we all agree on that point, because many different social levels and society communities have all agreed on it, and it's actually a phased approach on unification, so I think everyone agree on it. A lot of the past administrations also wanted to amend and change this NCUF, but one of the reasons of big failure was because it's not easy to do. So this is my opinion, because if you think about the NCUF, it's not just about changing the NCUF itself, but it's more about reconfiguring North and South Korea and changing and amending the legislature and bringing about change for the government as well as the civil society. So it's a holistic change that is required. And finding a substitute for that is not easy, and it's also needs the consensus of various different parties. I personally think that the NCUF does require lots of amendments and the majority of its aspects. It's not just about changing the core, but it needs to be amended and updated. So then, what needs to be complemented? I think that there are about 3 different aspects that require amendment. I think that the speakers have already mentioned, but I think that a phased and progressive approach is required because this is something that we really need to discuss. After the 2000, the key is really about reunification through further exchange, and it's also a peaceful reunification through these phases. But then again, I think that there's always this political and defense provocations that have gone awry. There's also differences in between the 2 Koreas. So this kind of reconciliation is quite difficult. Another aspect is the exchanges of economy and security have not truly gone well up until now. So in that respect, I think North Korea has to face the challenges met from the international community while trying to confront South Korea. So North Korea has already deemed the unification impossible, and that's why they are talking about the hostile country or hostile state strategy in order to stabilize its internal conditions. So that's why we believe the first phase of the NCUF's peaceful reconciliation and reunification is hit against a wall. And second, in terms of the unification formula, but also about the unification of the people, this eviction of the Cold War and globalization and democracy, all 3 of them is really at a crossroads, and it's also being challenged. I'm sure that you all know about this, but a lot of the international order that is facing both Koreas has changed. Democracy as well. A lot of people are even saying that there is no democracy anymore, that democracy is disrupted, and countries are turning towards deglobalization. And under these circumstances, South Korea's democracy is also at risk, and it's being threatened. In that aspect, do you think that this kind of democratization and peaceful reconciliation is truly possible? Then, I mean, if you ask that question, I think that you need detailed adjustments and negotiations, how we're going to change, how you're going to adjust to the environments of the changing democracy, and how people are going to really look into this in terms of the detailed aspects as well as the political aspects. And third is about the weakening of the unification formula. If you think about it, 30 years ago, we talked about how we needed to overcome the differences. But 30 years on from then, I think that there's a lot of discrepancy between North and South, and we've changed and morphed in different directions. So we also need to thinking of the identity of South Korea. It could be saying K-democracy, but it could also shows that we have changed and transformed, and we also have achieved economic development. And we kind of have that pride in the fact that we have been westernized and we have developed. And President Lee also made an address at CSIS, and he also mentioned about our neighbors who are poor and underdeveloped. But in one aspect, I think that in South Korea, I think he has mentioned the Korean public's sentiment well. He talked about poor countries and poor neighbors. How do we view them? Koreans have a negative perspective on that. And I think Professor Sandel yesterday also mentioned it very well in his keynote address yesterday. And another aspect that I'd like to mention is the anti-communism, anti-North Korea messages is also making up a big portion of the dialogue for North Korea. But then there's also a new chapter being opening up, which is anti-Chinese, anti-immigrants, and also those who are against those who might be a threat to the economy, the LGBTQ, and the justice as well as the fairness that the neoliberalism has created, or the post-war sentiment has created, has all kind of contributed to the public sentiment on how they view unification and North Korea. That's why I want to propose to maintain the NCUF. However, before we go into phase 1, we need to think about the preparation phase. Because North and South Korea have this cold relationship at the moment, we need to make this amicable and warm up the relations before we move on to phase 1. So we need to recognize each other and acknowledge each other first. Professor Sandel mentioned peaceful coexistence, and I think that peaceful coexistence must be the precursor to phase 1. So how do we achieve a peaceful coexistence? We need to be the ones that propose the method forward. And there's a lot of legislations and bills that are anti-North Korea and have a negative aspect about North Korea. We need to change them. In terms of the peaceful coexistence, I think that the people's exchange could be a way forward in order to reach that peaceful coexistence. And as for the Ministry of Unification, I think changing their name could send out a strong message. And last but not least, I think I have like 1 minute or so. So in order to do this, that's peaceful culture and peace education is also very important. In order to create peace culture and peace education, we need to look towards the Western worlds. If you think about the indices in Korea, with the advent of the new millennial, I think that a lot of people are feeling bipolarization. However, in terms of the imbalance or the indices, the actual indices, they're very much below those of the United States or other Western worlds. So I think that comparatively, we feel that we have an unjust society or imbalanced society. However, in reality, I think that we see in some aspects that it's much better than other countries. I think that we need to be on a more equal basis and move away from conflict in order to reunite the two Koreas together. And this needs to be trained and educated. If I were to just speak for 30 more seconds, we talk about meritocracy. And I think that we need to truly embed this into the society because, of course, meritocracy creates different levels and statutes in the society, but this also is reflecting on North Korea, our perspectives of North Korea, because we think that North Korea is a loser because they're not as advanced as South Korea. But we really need to think about how to involve them and include them so that we can embrace North Korea and help them become more developed. So I think that that's what we need to transfer the overall society. And I'll speak until here. Thank you very much. So I think that she has talked about a lot of different aspects.
박사입니다. 한 10.
So we have the speaker, Senior Research Fellow Seo Bo-hyuk from Korea Institute for National Unification. My name is Seo Bo-hyuk, just introduced. Today's session will touch upon future development and the unification policy directions. When I was requested to deliver a speech, I was a little bit taken back. Why do we talk about the unification measures? The Ministry of Unification is the one to prepare for a possible or future unification. So we have to not only think about the current status, but also it has to prepare for what's to come down the road. When what's happening right now might not be very relevant with the end goal, maybe we can do deeper analysis on what we have right now. So that was my insight. My discussion points are fourfold, which you find in the booklet. First of all, the idea of the unification must be based on pacifism. So there is the word peace, and also the peace is included in the constitution, which is in line with international norms. So when we talk about peace in pacifist unification, we focus on the means, being peaceful. I think of Dr. Chang Jun-ha. He said all sorts of unification are the good ones. So against this backdrop that we see today, and also as we do deliver a message to young generation, would they mean valid? I wonder. I have some doubts. Regardless of the purpose or theory regarding unification, if you think about the current status and thinking about the unification, all the rationale behind in all the theories actually has focused on having that end goal, but what's to come after that has not been well addressed. Because the national division has given us huge amount of wounds and sufferings. And we have a long-standing desire to overcome all these sufferings and pains. But if you think about the Korean Peninsula and things going on here, and not only those externalities as well, peace is not just ending itself as a means itself. It starts off from the attitude to try to be peaceful, respecting everybody, and also pursuing coexistence. It can be a small community or a society, but the global village itself should be in that direction. So definitely it is something pursued through peaceful means. Thinking about the lost government and given the current North Korean regime, they have different stances. But then what is common is that peace through power or force, which is far from pacifist unification. Using violence of any sorts in the name of unification are not valid. That's why we said that we are not doing unification through absorbing the other side. It's a very well made point that we are not going to do something like that, because it might lead to even deeper wounds if we do that. And also the second point, I know it might be rather controversial, but I will just pinpoint it anyway. In thinking about free democracy, so we are to abide by this concept based on constitution. Well, as for the ill usage, or things that have happened in wrongdoings by not abiding by it are just everywhere. We have seen it throughout the history so far. As we talk about freedom here, or liberty, it is rather arrogant to say that it is at the very top of the list. The freedom to take advantage of other resources, and also the freedom to maximize freedom in one's domain and others. It's not something a democratic scheme or liberal democracy talk about. But then we have had many faulty administration policies. We see very extreme bipolarization on the globe and destruction of the ecological system. All of these phenomena actually are justified in the name of freedom or liberty, which is nonsensical. I think that the free democracy has been the result of Cold War as well. But then not only humans, but also non-humans like flora, fauna, we have had lots of side effects. Talking about this concept and talking about unification, is it valid? Is it appropriate? I wonder. We can just say democracy. Even when we include liberal democracy, there are different sorts of democracy. But when you say liberal democracy or free democracy, different facets of democracy might come to surface, and something we have done so far. So I would like to expand the concept starting from the democracy itself. And also we've had July 4th North-South Joint Declaration, and then North Korea actually regards us as hostile nation. But in the principle of national unity, we propose a revision of the spirit while considering the reality of long-term division and the need for various participation. Here, we definitely need to consider democracy. But we need to think about the validity in persuading North Korea to believe in it. So we talk about people unity. Yes, that's true, but then there are lots of expats living on the Korean Peninsula who are not our people, so to speak. To have unification, we need to have inter-Korean cooperation as well as international cooperation happening at the same time. So I think that people cooperation actually is the principle of cooperation based, I think. And also, we have a 3-stage unification process. So it's actually the end goal is to have, so to speak, one unified country. But I don't know how the North Korean regime will change its mind. But anyway, when we do seek for a peaceful means unification, we still actually would have to respect each other, and we have to be closer to be united. In the process or in that transition, we have made some agreements on the June 15 Joint Declaration 2000. Maybe we can think of ways to reach commonalities. Maybe I'd like to propose federation state as a transition as we reach the final goal. Doesn't mean that we accept their stance, but we ourselves in South Korea, we are a strong ally with the U.S. So in this very long-term goal, why is it that the federation concept was not achieved? It's because of the anti-communist thought. U.S., Germany, and Switzerland, they're all federation-based states. So among differences, they live still under the same roof, but then try to synergies. So try to have a somewhat or a quasi-unity despite differences. That kind of spirit must be reflected by having federation. And as for the priest Munikan, so given that democracy develops further, he actually made sure that there is thriving of local governments. That's why I mentioned this concept of a federation framework. I think this actually would be starting out with a low level of federation. I think it dates back to 1989. And back then, North Korean regime was not like what it is today, and maybe they had to do like low level of federation. But anyway, applying the theory of federation might be different than what's going to happen. But this is something we need to delve onto. And even the North-South Confederation is also belonging to the concept of federation as well. Number 3. I think the first stage is reconciliation and cooperation. But think about it. Among the stages, are we to have the peaceful scheme? Would it happen at the same time and framework? Maybe there are some differences within. So we have this concept of non-nuclear peace regime. Anyway, we need to pursue denuclearization and still bring North Korea back to the table. In the diplomatic process, there might be some pressure. But anyway, realistically speaking, we have this concept of non-nuclear peace regime. But if we do not include that to the agenda, maybe the end result might be very different than what we do imagine, because denuclearization is first and foremost most important. Thank you so much, all the four panelists. So they've given us their thoughts and ideas. And I know that you have some questions and comments, but let me ask questions based on the discussion points.
그
So first, I think that they spoke in Korean, but there's also in English as well. But Dr. Seo only mentions it as reunification instead of unification. In Korean, it's the same. So I also want to ask you why that is.
Yes, I have a reason. Because the Korea Institute for National Unification, where I'm working, if you see page 50, it's called KINU, K-I-N-U. I mean, we are a national institute, and it says unification, not reunification. I am against this idea, as we're not talking about just generic terminology of unification. So we actually had to be split because of external forces, and there was a lot of injustice for our long-standing split. And I mean, it all feels natural that we live in a divided world. But then we have to think about the historical rationale. It's pretty much the concept of reuniting ourselves, not just unifying ourselves, because we were one before. So that's why maybe you can think of like national community unification formula, but then reunification is what I'd like to argue for. Thank you. I mean, you didn't read the English, I think, but then the reason why I asked you is because there's a difference. And as Dr. Seo mentioned, what was unique about his point was that we might have the concept of federation between confederation and unified Korea. This concept actually came into being in the 70s by Kim Dae-jung. So as we have federation, and then unified state. Maybe a similar concept with that. And also, maybe when you think of the NCUF, there might be 4 stages, because we are including federation. And also, in June 15 Joint Declaration, there were some commonalities in our achievement of unified state. So on this, Dr. Cho can mention it, the 3-stage mentioned by DJ, and also 3 stages of NCUF, and also June 15 Joint Declaration.
Thank you very much for the question. You also mentioned in the June 15th Joint Declaration, there's also a confederation concept, and there's also a commonality, and that's why there is an agreement saying that this is the unification method. This kind of confederation that the North Korean side also suggested is talking about how the communism has fell in the late 80s and looking into a federate state has the defense powers as well as the diplomacy powers, but it's actually relaying over to local municipalities to delegate. So I think that's why they agreed on a common basis. However, after the June 15th Joint Declaration, everyone was a little bit taken aback, because when North and South Korea came to the table and agreed on a policy agreement, for Korea, we have it in phase 2, and North Korea has a low level of Confederate state progress. And I think that Mr. Cho also mentioned when President Kim Dae-jung mentioned 3 different phases. So first is about the joining in Confederate state of South and North. So of course we need more exchanges and unification, but it's about setting the framework and then having a direction and then having the exchanges to facilitate that, and that's phase one. So the confederation that they are talking about here is actually in different phases for North and South. So rather than President Kim Dae-jung mentioning his own opinion, but we thought that it was about, oh yes, we do have the same kind of framework or the process in phase two. That's why we do have some commonalities in your suggestion and our suggestion as well. That's why it was suggested like as such. So if you think about a confederation or a confederation policy, then North Korea has a lot of differences or different opinions on it. And it was only a coined term among academics. But I think that President Kim Dae-jung, during the Labor Party in the 1980s, had been talking about this. And of course, it's actually just a form of unification. That's why they had mentioned it. Another important aspect is what we already talked about. North Korea is talking about two-state policy. But I think that it's not in the same vein if we are talking about in CUF when North Korea is talking about two separate nations or two hostile states. Is it North Korea denying unification, or is it because they're recognizing that it's difficult to unify? I think that there are two different perspectives. Because North Korea, in general, what we are saying about North Korea is that North Korea, once they declared the two hostile states, they have denounced the unification concept. How do you think about this, Professor Wang? I think it was 2 years ago. Head of Secretary Im Jong-seok also mentioned, we should not unify. We just should relay that onto the next generation, and that's why there was a lot of criticism regarding his comment. But then when North Korea said or talked about the two hostile states or the two separate nations, then was there any kind of different conditions involved?
All right, on that note, maybe I can talk about 2 or 3 points. So hostile two states, Kim Jong-un's stance was made like that. It was made official. So before that timing, though, in Yoon administration, so there was this discussion to officially discuss North Korea as hostile state. So the wording actually just even before the launch of the government, and there was like a partial approach to make it happen. So the main enemy concept was his stance, and in response to that, North Korea actually came up with one step further with hostility from South Korea. A stronger hostility actually would come back from North Korea. It's a pattern that's been going on for many years. So this bilateral state concept, I think, came into being against this backdrop. And then, I mean, it doesn't mean that there's inclusion of a message that we are not doing unification. Even before that, if you look at the documents produced from North Korea, presidents from South Korea, I mean, including the president himself, whether it's conservative or progressive, the intention is the same, to do absorption-based unification. So it's meaningless to talk about unification. Absorption-based unification is to unify by absorbing the other side. So that's why he mentioned two states. And one of the thinkings that he had was that it was meaningless or hard to accept when South Korea is talking about absorption-based unification. I think that's his intention. And if you were to reinterpret it more, what if South Korea were not to do absorption-based unification and then talk about inter-Korean unification? I would get the nuance that he is willing to come to the table, talk about unification. One more comment is that bilateral states actually would imply that South and North actually, I mean, it is going against the concept that the two states are actually going in the same unification goal. And then bilateral states means that we are all very different countries. In this aspect, I think we should go with the provision that we are a single nation. I mean, it might be two different states in UN scheme, but in talking about unification, we are of the same people. So this is the approach we need to take. I know there is a duality in the concept, but we have to be aware of the reality. And for the same reasons I mentioned, hopefully North Korea could come to sustain this concept. But then if they actually would think that we are two different states and then that we are the enemy of each other, then maybe things will not progress as we want. Thank you. Thank you so much for making the summary of it. Regarding the bilateral state theory, there are a lot of hot potatoes to discuss. So I was going to mention all these. And one more thing is that if you think about discourses that happened in civil organizations, academia, progressives actually had come up with the idea of unification in the agenda. I think the mood overall has changed. I think you might also guess it as well. Because thinking about Lee Myung-bak administration, Park Geun-hye administration, and Yoon Suk-yeol administration, they were pushing for unification. But civil organizations and progressive organizations, instead of unification, peaceful coexistence have been mentioned a lot. Just like Dr. Suh mentioned, peace has been more focused on by these entities. So maybe in preparing for the federal system of the Korea, so the bilateral state system has mentioned a lot though. So maybe we can just be two different countries, according to some. Dr. Suh actually mentioned that, is it unification or peace? Well, it's not that kind of black and white split. I think he actually can elaborate on it more. In the matter of peace versus unification, maybe he can talk about it more, because he said it's not something black and white. Thank you so much for the opportunity. But regarding the previous topic, I'd like to add some comment. So hostile bilateral state theory, just like Professor Wang had said, in Kim Jong-un's speech, this bilaterality actually was clearly indicated. What it means is that, number one, in December of 2023, the ambition of the rogue states, whether they are progressive or conservative, is pretty much the same. They are pursuing the single goal of absorption-based unification. So it is exactly same in line with what Professor Wang said. As we deal with unification topic, there's nothing in the middle between progressives versus conservatives. So they will think that we are just pursuing absorption-based unification. So they want to talk about unification. But another interpretation is that, he said it in the same speech. It's not the relation of the same people or homogeneity. We are two different states having confrontation. And maybe it was the next January, maybe it was a rather different nuance that came out. So what they try to say is that whether it's absorption-based unification and without hostility policy, there's no alternative. So they can only come to the table only when there is no mentioning or idea of absorption-based unification. So we got the action from South Korea that's continuous. Kim Jong-un actually has made some responses, but then there has been indication of their stance on a steady basis. With the end of the Cold War, when Kim Il-sung was alive, so there was the Our People First policy was announced back then. So the people concept actually was what I researched on in North Korea. It could be people from both Koreas, it could be people of Kim Il-sung, and also it could be also that overseas Koreans who are in favor of the DPRK stance. And then they actually came up with People First policy in Kim Jong-un leadership. And that is also the leadership motto of the leader Kim. So it is to solidify stance. And they realize that it's hard to do unification through communism. So they have been preparing for this kind of concept announcement for many years to come. And also regarding the relations between peace and unification is something I'm very much interested in. And it's something I've been searching a lot on as well. Thinking about unification, it is the very critical end goal to achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula. I know it's not going to be an end goal, so it's almost like chicken or egg, right? So is it peace or unification? Maybe talking about which comes first, it's rather nonsensical because the first goal we can achieve is unification to achieve peace. If unification cannot be made, maybe you can do peace and coexistence. Maybe it can be a rather passive level of pacifism. It's not easy, though, without the cooperation from North Korea. It has been shown through the escalation of the regime. But then with all the tension and hostility, it will not make it possible. Even if it might seem like pacifism on the surface, maybe it's not so if you look down. So regardless of the political stance, whether leftist or rightist, we really need to have we have to realize that achieving peace is not something that is either less or more important than unification itself, because it's going to be our end goal.
Thank you. Earlier, Professor Kim pointed out that after 80 years of division, the sense of estrangement between people has deepened. And in the reality of a transition towards a multicultural society, the current unification formula is basically built on the concept of nation or the concept of a national community. Is that still valid today? And many points were raised earlier, but even if we accept the need for some unification formula, we have to ask, in the changed reality, setting aside issues like North Korea's nuclear weapons or the new Cold War, is a unification plan based on the concept of a nation or national community still realistic? That's what I would like to hear your views on. Thank you very much. Let me respond to that question and also add a few points.
관련돼서 저희가 한 1년 내내 아마 전문가들은 이야기를 했던 것 같습니다. 그러니까
First, on the two-state theory. Over the past year, it seems that experts have been discussing it constantly. After every meeting, the topic comes up. And even if you read the last section of any paper, it often appears again. This shows how difficult it is for South Korean society to accept it, especially because Kim Jong-un was the first who raised it.
어려운 그런 상황이 있는 것이 아닌가 뭐 그런 생각도 들고요. 그리고 아까 이제 왕성태 선생님도 말씀하셨지만
As Professor Wang also mentioned, inter-Korean relations are highly organic, almost like a living organism. For example, when the Lee Jae-myung government came in and immediately suspended all measures in the border region, North Korea did react, not only with strong responses, but also with subtle signals as well. Which suggests that depending on our actions, the relationship could shift in a different direction. So the situation is quite complex. My own position is that we need to look more carefully at the internal situation in both South and North Korea. Policies, discourses, political logic, these cannot be separated from people's perceptions. When scholars debate unification or peace in the context of the two-state theory, they get very passionate.
두 국가론을 가지고 남북한 통일 평화 이쪽을 연구하시는 분들은 굉장히 흥분하지만 사실 일반 시민들 같은 경우
But for ordinary citizens, most people think, wasn't it already like that? Because in their daily lives, reality already feels like two separate states. And in that situation, even if the Unification Ministry keeps emphasizing the national community formula or keeps stressing the importance of unification, I don't think it resonates socially. I don't think it creates any real public response. I'm not saying that we need to completely scrap the formula or rename it and let politicians fight over it again, but we need to acknowledge that reality has changed. And that's the key point that I want to emphasize.
것을 반드시 받아들일 필요가 있다라는 말씀을 꼭 드리고 싶고요. 그리고 이제 저는 또 북한 주민들
I also think the same goes for North Korean citizens. Many people just assume that they want unification because they believe life would be better if they were reunited with the South. But I think that that perspective is risky. First, we don't actually know if that's true. And second, for North Koreans, whether they choose unification or not would depend on what conditions actually allow them to live better lives. Then the question is, can we really present such conditions? Conditions under which unification would lead to a more harmonious and happier life. I fear that our society, politics, and our economy are not fully prepared for that. That is something I hope will be taken into account in future discussions. And now, regarding the idea of nation, or what I sometimes call K-nation, I think South Korea, there are two different directions. One is the view that since the nation is divided, it must be made whole again, one Korean nation. At the same time, Korean society has already become highly multicultural. Many people today identify with a cosmopolitan Korea. That reality must be considered, which means the idea of restoring a community based purely on shared bloodline and ethnicity no longer resonates on a wide scale. The same applies to historical issues. If we look at how discourse on past history has evolved, it no longer develops in the old way. It's becoming more pragmatic, tied to survival and economic concerns, and new forms of community are being built in that context. And that is why we need to think about a more open, more inclusive idea of nation. And that is extremely important. Finally, one last point. When we talk about the national community unification formula, or a nation-centered unification, the question is, can we present the concept of nation in an open context? If it is based on a very closed perspective of nationalism, then any vision or any suggestion of unification based on that kind of basis will not be able to generate a positive response. This will also inevitably lead to major conflicts and harm. Well then, thank you very much. Before passing the microphone onto the floor, I'd like to make one last comment and pose a question to Vice Minister Choi. When you spoke earlier, you noted how difficult it is to devise a new unification formula, especially one based on the concept of a national community. I think you must have sensed through today's discussion just how challenging it is to design such a plan. You also mentioned not only the context, but also the procedure and the format, that we need something like the National Unification Agreement, a new citizen-led development plan. But here is the problem. Even among ourselves, drafting a unification formula is extremely difficult. It's hard enough to bridge the divide between the Conservative Party and the Progressive Party. And on top of that, there's also the question of how much North Korea will be willing to accept. So regarding this so-called National Unification Agreement, you mentioned that while North Korea never officially adopted the terminology of the formula, in substance, they did accept some of its content. So if so, in the case of a new national community-based unification plan, if we want North Korea to at least partly accept it, would there be an alternative that combines our citizen-led approach with a framework that could also persuade the North? Well, that's indeed a very difficult question. To come up with something that North Korea could also accept, it's extremely hard to produce such a plan all at once. As I mentioned earlier, back in 1989, when we had the National Community Unification formula, then we had the South-North Basic Agreement. And later, we revised the National Community Formula. But those were mostly top-down, and they were agreements among experts and government officials. They were not really communicated downwards to the people. And now the times have changed. The main actors in history have changed. And it's the younger generation, the so-called Gen Zs or MZ generation, who will have to live in the future. They need to participate in large numbers. And we need a bottom-up process that builds public opinion from the people, from below. And that was the point that I wanted to emphasize. Professor Kim also raised the question, with a closed concept of nation, can we really have meaningful dialogue or discourse? I believe the procedure itself must involve this dialogue with this younger generation, and also in that process create a broad consensus that reflects the overall thoughts of today's society. From there, then naturally new ideas can spread. For example, the idea of a community of residents living together on the Korean Peninsula. And from our experience, when the average people, ordinary citizens, participate, the government doesn't really interfere. And unexpected issues emerge. Sometimes they consider North Korea's position even more carefully than the government does. This is something I personally witnessed. So when such inputs are gathered and turned into policy, and then approved by the National Assembly, it becomes binding, so no future government can easily scrap it. That would provide both consistency and stronger persuasive power towards the North. Another thing I found very rewarding was participants often said that, oh, I feel like a real citizen of democracy, something that they had only read about in books. They felt empowered because their words were reflected into real policies. So this process is not only important for overcoming division and building peace, but it's also important for healing and bridging differences within our own society and for advancing democratization. It's not a silver bullet that solves everything, but it can serve as one meaningful alternative to address these challenges. Yes, in fact, one of the points I raised earlier was this. Since unification is inevitably a long-term process, new generations will continue to emerge in North Korea as well. So discussions and efforts that target only the older generation, I don't think they'll be very effective. That's why I thought this generational aspect should also be added to the debate. I'd like to invite Professor Wang for a brief comment, 1 or 2 minutes if possible. As we were talking, something came to mind, and I felt that I really had to say this. The issue of unification is a matter of great importance to the state and to the nation. No other country struggles with it the way that we do. It's a uniquely Korean concern. But because we focus so heavily on how to achieve unification, we often end up concluding that it's too difficult. I'd like to suggest a highly different approach. The reason we even talk about unification is because of division. The division began in 1945 and it deepened with the war in 1950. That first division in 1945, I see it as the most fundamental, the most important division. And yet in our debates, the question of how we should address that division, that is missing. So before we argue about the necessity of unification, we should first discuss, do we accept the circumstances of division or not? On August 15th, 1945, when Korea was first divided, not a single element of our people was reflected. It was 100% imposed by foreign powers, and this led to tragedy, it led to war, and it created the situation we face today. This is something we didn't choose. It was imposed from the outside, and it produced such tragedy, and because of it, correcting that origin, restoring normalcy, is essential. No matter of preference, it's an essential national task. And of course, we should debate the benefits and costs of unification. But fundamentally, division is a national issue that must be corrected. It's a historic task of the Korean people and the Korean state. If it remains unresolved, we must also worry about the Republic of Korea and how the Korean people of the future will be judged by the world as well. Thank you very much. I've already asked some of the questions that you might have been curious about, so still I'm sure there's a lot of points that have not been covered. We don't have much time left, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, so I'd now like to open the floor. Please focus on questions rather than sharing personal comments. So can I ask to deliver the microphone? Let's start with the person in the back. So please also indicate who your question is being addressed to. Mr. Wang, it's nice to see you again. I first met you when you were working as a journalist at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. And now we meet again here for the first time. Your point was a very important one. You provided a source that many of us may not have known. When General MacArthur was preparing to advance northward into North Korea, the Soviet Union made a proposal. This was, I believe, in 1948, January 23rd. At the time, the UN was preparing to enter the north, and the Soviets had previously blocked it. But then they said they would accept it. They agreed to hold general elections in the north and to follow the instructions of the United Nations. That's why later in September of 1991, the UN admitted both North and South Korea as member states, in effect recognizing them too as separate states. Can you please focus on the question? Yes, so let me conclude. At the time, China and the United States, China should have encouraged the US to establish relations with North Korea. And in those days, with the atmosphere shaped by German unification, the South-North Basic Agreement was created. And now we must be bold. In line with the UN's recommendations and spirit, we should abolish the basic agreement. And as was mentioned earlier, we should move towards a system of two mutually beneficial states. To our government, yes, that might require constitutional opinion as well, but that does not sound like a question. So the gentleman in the front, please, a microphone. As I mentioned earlier, we will stop exactly at 50 minutes. I turned 70 this year, and throughout the 70 years, the relationship between North and South has not changed at all. So I wonder, how many of us here can really understand what the professors have been saying today? I'd like to ask a question to Professor Hall. I don't fully understand this phrase, all unifications are unification. What exactly does that mean? And in your remarks, you also talked about expanding the concept of liberal democracy to allow for other forms of democracy. Does that mean then the North Korean people's democracy should also be included? And if so, are we to agree to a form of unification led by North Korea? I find that doubtful. Okay, let's stop there because we don't have time for more. We'll now move to answers. Vice Minister Choi, just one question for you. In a situation without nuclear weapons, the federal system has to be changed, but changed to what? And for the younger Gen Z, if the system has to be changed to what exactly? Can you provide us with quite a simple answer? Thank you. We all talk about different kinds of democracy, but when I do, I'm not referring specifically to North Korea's people's democracy. What I mean is, let us examine all the forms of democracy that have existed in human history. In that sense, whether it's people democracy, civil democracy, or priority, all of these can be considered. From there, we can accept what is reasonable, reject what's not good, and then gather the rational elements. We could give them a new name or highlight a particular element, and with that, North and South together could form new democratic elements for unification. The nuclear issue has now become a far more serious obstacle in inter-Korean relations. and on the path towards unification than ever before. So denuclearization must, of course, be seen as a key task. As for the Gen Z, once again, these people are the sovereign. Their views are important, and since the democratic makeup of the population is changing, we must actively listen to the voices of those who now form a larger part of society. It's not that they're indifferent and therefore we should ignore them. On the contrary, we must go out of our way to listen and to make sure their opinions are included. We must also encourage so that they can think for themselves, and that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you. I'm sure there are still questions, but since our time is up, we'll have to close here for today. Today's theme was the future direction of the National Community Unification Formula, and we've heard a great deal of discussion and listened to the experts and also questions from the floor. There must be differences in opinion, but the reason Ministry of Unification hosts this kind of international conference is to precisely monitor these diverse discussions. And on the basis of these discussions, I believe we can develop a more advanced proposal for the future. I know we had to rush a little bit to keep the time, but I think that we still were able to cover a lot. Thank you all for staying until the end and listening attentively, and thank you to our panelists. We'll conclude today's session. Thank you very much.